The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital hummed their endless mechanical song, casting harsh shadows across the emergency room floor at 2:47 a.m. The night shift was drawing to its exhausted close, but for Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old trauma nurse with gentle hands and worried eyes, the approaching dawn carried no promise of rest. It carried only fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the same patient chart she'd been staring at for the past 10 minutes, the words blurring together, as her attention remained fixed on the glass doors leading to the parking lot. Through the reflection of the fluorescent lighting, she could see him there in the darkness, a motionless figure leaning against a blue sedan, cigarette ember glowing like a predator's eye. Waiting. Always waiting. She pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her pale green scrubs, the fabric doing little to hide the purple fingerprint bruises that decorated her forearms like a constellation of cruelty. Those marks told a story she'd been too terrified to speak aloud, a nightmare that had been unfolding for months in slow, suffocating increments. If you believe that heroes come in all forms, that courage can wear leather instead of badges, and that sometimes the most unlikely people become guardian angels when darkness falls, then take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this story might just restore your faith in humanity and remind you that goodness still exists in the shadows. Sarah Elena Martinez had dedicated her life to healing others. For 7 years, she'd walked the sterile corridors of Mercy General Hospital, saving lives during gang shootings, comforting families through their darkest hours, and working double shifts when the understaffed ER needed her most. She'd seen humanity at its worst and its best, but nothing in her medical training or life experience had prepared her for the nightmare that walked into her life wearing a $1,000 suit and a predator's smile. His name was Dr. Vincent Cross, and he wasn't just any patient. He was a respected cardiac surgeon from the prestigious Riverside Medical Center across town, a man whose reputation preceded him like a golden shadow. When he'd arrived 6 months ago with a dislocated shoulder from a skiing accident, he'd been charming, articulate, and seemingly harmless. The nurses had whispered about how handsome he was, how polite, how different from the usual emergency room chaos they dealt with nightly. Sarah had treated him professionally, efficiently, the way she treated every patient. But something in his pale blue eyes had made her skin crawl, a coldness that contradicted his warm smile and gentle words. When he'd asked for her number, she'd politely declined, citing hospital policy and professional boundaries. Most men would have accepted the rejection gracefully. Dr. Vincent Cross was not most men. The flowers started arriving the next week. Expensive arrangements delivered to the nurse's station with cards that grew increasingly personal, increasingly possessive. To the angel who healed me, read the first. Thinking of you during every surgery, read the 5th. You belong with someone who understands your worth. Read the 10th. When Sarah threw the flowers away and asked the receptionist to refuse future deliveries, the gifts changed. Coffee appeared at her workstation with notes about how he'd remembered she liked vanilla creamer. Her favorite lunch from the Italian place downtown would mysteriously appear in the break room refrigerator with her name on it. He somehow knew her schedule, her preferences, details about her life that she'd never shared with him. The phone calls to her apartment started in month 2. Late-night hang-ups that happened just as she was falling asleep. Then calls where he would speak, his voice soft and reasonable, explaining how they were meant to be together, how he could give her everything she deserved. When she changed her number, he found the new one within days. By month 3, Sarah realized with growing horror that Dr. Cross had been conducting a study of her life with the same methodical precision he brought to heart surgery. He knew she lived alone in the small apartment above Mrs. Chin's bakery on Maple Street. He knew she drove a 2015 Honda Civic with a small dent in the rear bumper. He knew she stopped at the corner market every Tuesday for groceries, and that she volunteered at the free clinic on Saturday mornings. The breaking point came when she found him sitting in her car one evening after a shift. Not threatening, not violent, just sitting in her passenger seat like he belonged there, explaining calmly that her apartment building had poor security and that a woman like her needed protection. The police report she filed disappeared into bureaucratic limbo when they discovered his reputation and connections. Doctors just being overly friendly, the desk sergeant had said with a dismissive shrug. Maybe you're misreading the situation. But Sarah wasn't misreading anything. The coincidental encounters at the grocery store, the way he always seemed to know her schedule, the photos of her apartment building that appeared on her windshield. It was all part of a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to break down her resistance until she had no choice but to accept his attention. Tonight, as she finished her rounds and prepared for the end of her shift, Dr. Cross was out there in the parking lot again. He'd been there for the past 4 hours, smoking cigarettes and checking his expensive watch, a patient predator waiting for his prey to emerge from the safety of the Markin cells. Hospital's walls. At 3:15 a.m., the emergency room's relative quiet was shattered by the wail of sirens and the urgent crackle of radio chatter. Incoming trauma, motorcycle versus guardrail, on Highway 9, ETA 3 minutes. The dispatcher's voice cut through the hospital's late-night calm like a blade. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, her personal fears temporarily pushed aside by the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine. She grabbed fresh supplies and prepared the trauma bay, her movements efficient and practiced despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like lead. The paramedics burst through the doors, wheeling a stretcher that carried a mountain of a man whose leather vest was torn and bloody, but whose eyes were alert and furious with embarrassment rather than pain. The patient was enormous, easily 6'4", and built like a linebacker who'd spent years moving heavy machinery. His graying beard was streaked with road dust, and despite the obvious pain he was in, he kept trying to sit up and wave off the medical attention. I'm fine, he growled in a voice like gravel mixed with honey. Just need some stitches, and I'll be on my way. Got brothers waiting for me. The patch on his torn leather vest read, Iron Wolves MC, with Tank embroidered below it in silver thread. His real name, Sarah would learn, was Marcus Tank Rodriguez, a 47-year-old ironworker who'd been riding motorcycles for 30 years without a single accident until tonight, when a deer had jumped into his path on the dark highway. As Sarah began cleaning the road rash on his massive forearms, she noticed something that made her hands pause. Tank's eyes weren't focused on his injuries or the medical equipment around him. They were fixed on her face, studying her with the intense concentration of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people's souls through their expressions. You all right, darlin'? He asked quietly, his rough voice softening with genuine concern. You look like you ain't slept in a week. Sarah managed a tired smile, the kind she'd perfected after years of reassuring patients and their families. Just a long shift. Let's focus on getting you fixed up. But Tank wasn't buying her deflection. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of honest labor, remained still as she worked on his wounds. He'd seen that particular kind of exhaustion before, not the tiredness that came from hard work, but the bone-deep weariness that came from constant fear. How long has he been following you? Tank asked suddenly, his voice so quiet that only Sarah could hear him. Sarah's hands froze mid-suture. She looked up into Tank's dark brown eyes and saw something that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. This was a man who'd seen predators before, who understood the difference between normal stress and the particular brand of terror that came from being hunted. I don't know what you mean, she whispered, but her voice cracked on the lie. Tank's expression grew gentler, more patient. Honey, I got 3 daughters and 4 granddaughters. I know what a scared woman looks like, and I know what kind of man puts that look in her eyes. So I'm going to ask you again, and this time I want you to tell me the truth. How long has he been following you? The kindness in his voice, so unexpected from such an intimidating man, broke something loose in Sarah's chest. Tears she'd been holding back for months suddenly threatened to spill over as she continued working on his wounds with shaking hands. 6 months, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. He's a doctor. Respected. Connected. The police won't listen, and I don't know what to do anymore. Tank's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see the muscles in his neck cord with controlled anger. But when he spoke, his voice remained gentle, soothing. Is he out there now? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. What's his name? Dr. Vincent Cross. He's a cardiac surgeon at Riverside Medical Center. Tank committed the name to memory with the same precision he used to memorize blueprints at construction sites. When does your shift end? 20 minutes. Tank was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent years solving complex problems under pressure. Finally, he spoke. I need you to do me a favor, darling. I need you to call your supervisor and tell them you're feeling sick. Tell them you need to stay here for another hour or two. Sarah looked at him with confusion. Why? Tank's smile was gentle, but his eyes held the promise of a coming storm. Because I'm going to make some phone calls, and I want to make sure you're safe in here while I do. Tank waited until Sarah had stepped away to speak with her supervisor before pulling out his phone. The device looked comically small in his massive hands. As he scrolled through his contacts, his expression growing more determined with each passing second. The first call was to James Hammer McKenzie, the president of the Iron Wolves MC. Hammer answered on the second ring despite the early hour, his voice alert and concerned. Tank, what's wrong, brother? Heard you had a spill. Hammer, I need the Brotherhood. Tonight. Right now. Tank's voice carried an urgency that made Hammer sit up in his bed across town. What are we dealing with? Tank glanced towards Sarah, who was explaining her situation to the night supervisor with obvious reluctance. Got a predator stalking one of the nurses here at Mercy General. Some hotshot doctor who thinks his reputation makes him untouchable. She's been living in terror for 6 months, and the cops won't help. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of Hammer's boots hitting the floor. How many? All of them, brother. Every patch holder, every prospect, every friend of the club. I want this piece of garbage to understand exactly what happens when someone hurts the innocent. Consider it done. Give me 30 minutes to make the calls. Tank's second call was to his son-in-law, Detective Ray Martinez with the City Police Department. Ray had married Tank's oldest daughter 5 years ago and had learned to respect the moral code that governed the Iron Wolves, even if he didn't always understand their methods. Ray, it's Tank. I need you to run a name for me. Dr. Vincent Cross, cardiac surgeon at Riverside Medical. Tank, it's almost 4 in the morning. What's this about? This is about a predator who's been stalking a nurse, and your department's been useless. I need to know if this guy has any priors, any complaints, anything that might help us understand what we're dealing with. Ray sighed, but Tank could hear computer keys clicking in the background. Tank, whatever you're planning, I'm not planning anything illegal, Ray. But this ends tonight. Holy shit. Ray's voice changed as information populated his screen. Tank, this guy. Jesus. He's got 3 restraining orders from different women over the past 5 years. All dismissed on technicalities or settled out of court. There's a sealed complaint from a nurse in Chicago. Another from a resident in Philadelphia. This guy's a serial predator. Tank's grip tightened on the phone. Can you get copies of those files? Not legally. But Tank, if something happens to this guy and it comes back to the club, nothing's going to happen to him that he doesn't bring on himself, Ray. I give you my word. Tank's third call was to his nephew Miguel, who worked security at Riverside Medical Center. Within 10 minutes, Tank had Dr. Cross's home address, his schedule for the next 2 weeks, and the license plate number of his blue sedan. As Tank made his calls, Sarah watched from the nurse's station with growing amazement. This gruff, intimidating biker was orchestrating something with the precision of a military operation, all for a stranger he'd met an hour ago. When he finally put his phone away and looked at her, his expression was grim but determined. How many friends does this doctor have? Tank asked. What do you mean? I mean, when push comes to shove, how many people are going to stand up for him? How connected is he really? Sarah thought about it. He has a reputation, but I don't think people actually like him. The nurses at his hospital call him Dr. Ice behind his back. He's cold, arrogant. I think most people are afraid of him rather than loyal to him. Tank nodded with satisfaction. Good. That makes this easier. Makes what easier? Before Tank could answer, the sound of motorcycle engines began to echo from the parking lot. Not just one or two bikes, but dozens of them. Their rumbling growing louder as they approached the hospital. Sarah's eyes widened as she watched through the windows as motorcycle pulled into the parking lot. Their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like stars falling to earth. Tank smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, the expression looked genuinely peaceful. That, darlin', is the sound of justice coming home to roost. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across a summer sky. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent, until the very walls of Mercy General Hospital seemed to vibrate with the collective roar of dozens of motorcycle engines. Sarah pressed her face to the emergency room windows and watched in amazement as the parking lot filled with motorcycles. They came in groups of 5 and 6, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a constellation of moving stars. Chrome gleamed under the parking lot lights, and leather-clad figures dismounted with the fluid precision of soldiers taking positions. There were sport bikes and cruisers, vintage Harleys and modern Indians, each machine lovingly maintained and ridden by someone who understood that a motorcycle wasn't just transportation. It was freedom given form and steel. The riders ranged from young men barely out of their teens to grizzled veterans whose beards were white with wisdom and whose eyes had seen more than most people could imagine. Tank watched the gathering with obvious pride, pointing out different riders to Sarah as they arrived. That's Hammer, our president. Been riding for 40 years, never broke his word to anyone. The woman next to him is Valkyrie. She's a trauma surgeon at Children's Hospital when she's not wearing her patch. The big guy with the red beard is Tiny, ironic name considering he's 6'8". He runs a non-profit that builds wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans. Each biker who entered the hospital stopped to check on Tank, their concern genuine and their anger palpable when they learned why they'd been called. These weren't the Hollywood stereotype of lawless criminals. They were iron workers and mechanics, nurses and teachers, veterans and business owners. They were fathers and grandfathers, mothers and daughters, people who'd found family and purpose in the brotherhood of the road. But they all shared one thing in common: an unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Dr. Vincent Cross, still waiting in his blue sedan, watched the gathering with growing unease. He'd been prepared to deal with a single exhausted nurse, not with what appeared to be an army of motorcycles. His confidence began to waver as rider after rider filled the parking lot, their presence transforming the quiet hospital into something that felt more like a fortress. Hammer McKenzie, the club president, was a man who'd learned leadership in the Marines before bringing those lessons to the Iron Wolves. At 55, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd never needed to raise his voice to be heard. His steel-gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that came from decades of reading people and situations. When he walked into the emergency room, still wearing his leather jacket despite the hospital's warmth, he moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that rushing led to mistakes. He found Tank sitting up on the examination table, his road rash cleaned and bandaged, his expression focused and angry. "Talk to me, brother," Hammer said without preamble. Tank gestured toward Sarah, who was trying to busy herself with paperwork while stealing glances at the gathering outside. "Nurse Sarah Martinez. Been working here 7 years. Saves lives for a living. Volunteers at the free clinic on her days off. 6 months ago, she treated a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Vincent Cross for a shoulder injury. Since then, he's been stalking her." Hammer's expression darkened as Tank provided more details. The flowers, the phone calls, the surveillance. The way Cross had managed to learn intimate details about Sarah's life. The police reports that had been buried. The complaints that had been dismissed. "Where is he now?" Hammer asked. Blue sedan. Northwest corner of the parking lot. Been sitting there for 4 hours, waiting for her shift to end. Hammer nodded and pulled out his phone. Within minutes, he coordinated with the other riders, establishing a perimeter around Cross's vehicle without approaching it directly. They weren't threatening him. Not yet. They were simply making their presence known, demonstrating that Sarah Martinez was no longer alone and unprotected. Meanwhile, other club members had dispersed throughout the hospital. Valkyrie, the trauma surgeon, had struck up a conversation with the night's supervisor, casually mentioning how important it was for hospitals to take security seriously, especially when it came to protecting their staff from dangerous individuals. Two of the younger riders had positioned themselves near the entrance, their presence deterring any thoughts Cross might have had about entering the building. The most crucial conversation, however, was happening in the parking lot itself. Miguel Rodriguez, Tank's nephew and a security guard at Riverside Medical, had arrived with a folder full of information about Dr. Cross. Birth date, home address, work schedule, even details about his finances and recent behavior at his own hospital. "This guy's been problematic for years," Miguel explained to Hammer. 3 sexual harassment complaints at Riverside, all settled quietly. The nurses there are terrified of him, but administration protects him because he brings in big money with his surgeries. Hammer studied the information with the same attention he'd once given to intelligence reports in Afghanistan. What about family? Wife? Kids? Anyone who might be collateral damage if this escalates? Divorced twice. No kids. Lives alone in a condo downtown. His ex-wives, both filed restraining orders that were mysteriously dropped when their lawyers advised them. It wasn't worth the fight. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd learned to use his reputation and connections as weapons, systematically terrorizing women who had no recourse through normal channels. He was a predator who'd perfected his hunting techniques over years of practice, always careful to stay just on the right side of legal consequences. But Dr. Vincent Cross had never encountered the Iron Wolves MC. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 4:30 a.m., as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Dr. Cross finally made his move. He'd watched the gathering of motorcycles with growing frustration, unable to understand why so many bikers had suddenly decided to visit Mercy General Hospital in the middle of the night. But his obsession with Sarah had reached a boiling point, and he wasn't going to let a few intimidating motorcycles keep him from what he considered his rightful claim. He stepped out of his sedan with the confidence of a man who'd never truly faced consequences for his actions. His expensive suit was wrinkled from hours of waiting, but he straightened his tie and smoothed his hair with the practiced vanity of someone who'd always relied on his appearance and reputation to open doors. Dr. Cross made it exactly 15 steps before he found his path blocked. Hammer McKenzie stood directly in front of the hospital's main entrance, not moving, not speaking, just existing like a mountain that had suddenly decided to relocate itself. At 55, Hammer had the kind of presence that made people step aside without being asked, but Dr. Cross, fueled by months of unchallenged predatory behavior, mistook patience for weakness. "Excuse me," Cross said with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to speak with one of the nurses inside." Hammer tilted his head slightly, studying Cross the way an entomologist might examine an interesting but unpleasant insect. "Hospitals closed to visitors. Emergency personnel only." "I'm a doctor," Cross replied, his voice taking on the edge of irritation. "Dr. Vincent Cross. Cardiac surgery. I have professional business inside." At 4:30 in the morning? The question hung in the air between them, simple and loaded with implication. "Doctor." Cross felt the first flicker of uncertainty as he noticed that other bikers had positioned themselves around the entrance, not threateningly, but with the quiet purpose of people who knew exactly what they were doing. "That's none of your concern," Cross said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "Now move aside before I call security." Hammer's smile was small and cold. "Security's already here, Doc. Take a look around." For the first time, Dr. Cross truly absorbed the scene around him. There weren't just a few motorcycles in the parking lot. There were dozens of them. Bikers stood near their machines, their attention focused on him with the intensity of people who'd been briefed on exactly who he was and what he'd been doing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somehow, his carefully maintained secret had been exposed. "I don't know what you think you know," Cross said, his voice rising slightly, "but you're making a serious mistake. I have connections in this city. Influence you can't imagine. One phone call from me, and what?" The voice came from behind him. Cross spun around to find Tank Rodriguez approaching, moving slowly despite his injuries. The big man's presence seemed to fill the parking lot, and his dark eyes held the promise of violence, carefully held in check. "You'll call your friends at the police department?" Tank continued, his voice conversational, but carrying an undercurrent of menace. "The same department that's been ignoring the face complaints against you for 6 months? The same department that buried the restraining orders from your ex-wives?" Cross's face went pale. "How did you, or maybe you'll call your buddies at Riverside Medical." Tank interrupted. "The administration that's been covering up your harassment of their nurses because you bring in revenue? The same people who've been quietly settling lawsuits against you for years?" Each word hit Cross like a hammer blow. His carefully constructed facade of respectability was crumbling, his secrets laid bare in the pre-dawn light. He looked around desperately, seeking an escape route, but found himself surrounded by a wall of leather and steel that offered no mercy. "See, Doc," Tank continued, stepping closer. "We know all about you. We know about Sarah Martinez, and we know about the women before her. We know about the phone calls at midnight, the flowers she never asked for, the way you've been watching her apartment. We know everything." The gathering of bikers had grown larger as Tank spoke. Sarah, watching from inside the hospital, counted at least 60 motorcycles now, with more arriving every few minutes. It wasn't just the Iron Wolves anymore. Word had spread through the broader motorcycle community, and riders from other clubs had come to stand in solidarity. The Guardians MC, the Steel Horsemen, the Desert Riders, patch holders who might be rivals on other days, but who shared a common code when it came to protecting the innocent. "Doctor," Cross tried one more time to assert his authority. "This is harassment. I'll have all of you arrested for." "For what?" Hammer's voice cut through Cross's bluster like a blade. "For standing in a public parking lot? For visiting a friend in the hospital? We haven't threatened you, Doc. Haven't touched you. We're just here to make sure you understand something important." Cross waited, his confidence evaporating with each passing second. "Nurse Martinez is under our protection now," Hammer continued. "That means if she feels unsafe, we'll be there. If she needs to get to her car safely, we'll be there. If someone decides to sit outside her apartment at midnight, we'll be there too." Tank stepped forward, his massive frame blocking out what little light remained from the parking lot lamps. "And Doc, if something happens to that young woman, if she gets hurt, if she disappears, if she has an accident, we'll know exactly where to look for answers." The threat was implicit but crystal clear. Dr. Cross was no longer hunting alone and unobserved. He'd become the hunted, and his predatory behavior was now under the scrutiny of people who wouldn't be intimidated by his reputation or deterred by his connections. As the sun began to rise over the city, transforming the hospital parking lot from a dark hunting ground into a place of light and safety, the true scope of what the Iron Wolves had accomplished became clear. This wasn't just about one nurse and one predator. It was about exposing a network of abuse that had been hidden behind medical degrees and professional courtesy for far too long. Miguel Rodriguez, Tank's nephew, had spent the early morning hours making phone calls to contacts throughout the medical community. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior that extended far beyond Sarah Martinez. Dr. Vincent Cross had been transferred between hospitals 3 times in the past decade, always with glowing recommendations from administrators who were quietly relieved to see him become someone else's problem. The first case was Dr. Lisa Chen, a resident at Philadelphia General who'd filed a complaint against Cross for stalking behavior. The complaint had disappeared when Cross's lawyer threatened to sue both Dr. Chin in the hospital for defamation. Dr. Chin had quietly transferred to a hospital in Oregon and never practiced in Pennsylvania again. The second case was nurse Amanda Foster at Chicago Memorial, who'd reported Cross for harassment after he'd followed her home from work multiple times. The hospital's response had been to transfer Foster to the night shift and suggest she might be more comfortable working at a different facility. Cross had received a written reprimand that was later removed from his file as part of a personnel review. The third case was Dr. Sarah Kim, a cardiac surgery fellow who'd accused Cross of quid pro quo sexual harassment. Her complaint had been investigated by a committee that included Cross's golf partner and drinking buddy. The committee had found insufficient evidence to support her claims, and Dr. Kim had been quietly blacklisted from cardiac surgery programs throughout the region. Each woman had been isolated, discredited, and ultimately driven away, while Cross had continued his predatory behavior with increasing confidence. But now, for the first time, he was facing an enemy that couldn't be intimidated by lawyers or influenced by professional connections. Word of the gathering at Mercy General had spread throughout the motorcycle community via social media and club networks. Riders who'd never met Sarah Martinez were arriving to stand in solidarity, understanding that this fight represented something larger than one woman's struggle against one predator. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying that some behaviors would not be tolerated, regardless of who perpetrated them. By 6 a.m., there were 87 motorcycles in the hospital parking lot, representing 12 different clubs and dozens of independent riders. They came from all walks of life: construction workers and accountants, veterans and teachers, nurses and mechanics. What united them wasn't their choice of transportation, but their shared commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The media had begun to take notice as well. A reporter from Channel 7 News had arrived to cover what initially appeared to be a motorcycle rally at the hospital. But the story quickly evolved when she learned about the stalking case and the systematic failures of law enforcement to address it. Her morning report would spark a social media firestorm that would ultimately force both Mercy General and Riverside Medical to address their policies regarding staff, safety, and predatory behavior. Dr. Cross, meanwhile, had retreated to his sedan, his hands shaking as he tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. His carefully constructed world of privilege and impunity was crumbling around him, and for the first time in his adult life, he was experiencing the fear that his victims had lived with for months or years. He tried calling his lawyer, but it was too early for the legal offices to be open. He tried calling the hospital administration, but was told that any personnel issues would need to be addressed during regular business hours. He tried calling the police, claiming he was being harassed, but the dispatcher informed him that standing in a public parking lot wasn't illegal and that if he felt unsafe, he was free to leave the area. Leave the area. The phrase echoed in Cross's mind as he stared at the gathering of bikers. For 6 months, he controlled every aspect of Sarah Martinez's life, trapping her in a web of fear and surveillance. Now, suddenly, he was the one being watched, the one whose movements were being tracked and recorded. Inside the hospital, Sarah Martinez was experiencing something she hadn't felt in 6 months: safety. The presence of 87 motorcycles in the parking lot had transformed Mercy General from a place of vulnerability into an impregnable fortress. But more than that, the kindness and respect shown by Tank and the other bikers had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten: her own strength. Tank found her in the break room during what should have been the end of her shift, sitting with a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the gathering of riders. Her expression was thoughtful rather than fearful, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked like someone who was planning rather than merely surviving. "How are you holding up, darlin'?" Tank asked, settling his massive frame into a chair that creaked under his weight. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I haven't just been hiding from Dr. Cross. I've been hiding from myself." Tank waited, understanding that some truths needed time to emerge. "I used to be different," Sarah continued. "Stronger. Before all this started, I was the kind of person who stood up to bullies, who who spoke out when I saw injustice. I became a nurse because I wanted to heal people, to make a difference. But these past 6 months, I've been so focused on just surviving that I forgot who I used to be. Survival ain't nothing to be ashamed of, Tank said gently. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. But it's not. Enough anymore, Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. Watching you and your friends risk everything for a stranger. Seeing the way you stood up to someone everyone else was afraid to confront. It's reminded me that hiding isn't living. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sea of motorcycles that represented her newfound safety. I want to file a formal complaint against Dr. Cross. Not just with the police, but with the state medical board, with his hospital administration, with anyone who will listen. I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else. Tank smiled, recognizing the return of the strength that had always been inside her. That's going to be a long fight, Sarah. He's got money, connections, lawyers. Are you sure you're ready for that? Sarah turned to face him, and Tank was surprised by the steel in her eyes. I've been fighting him alone for 6 months. Now, I have 87 brothers and sisters in leather who've shown me what real strength looks like. I think I'm ready. The transformation was remarkable. The frightened, isolated woman who'd whispered for help just hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her individual struggle was part of a larger battle against systemic abuse and institutional indifference. The Iron Wolves hadn't just protected Sarah Martinez. They'd helped her rediscover Sarah Martinez. Over the next hour, Sarah worked with Tank and several other bikers to document everything that had happened over the past 6 months. They photographed the bruises on her arms, compiled copies of the police reports that had been filed and ignored, and gathered testimony from other hospital staff who'd witnessed Cross's inappropriate behavior. Valkyrie, the trauma surgeon who rode with the Iron Wolves, provided contact information for attorneys who specialized in stalking cases and workplace harassment. Miguel Rodriguez used his security connections to obtain surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot, showing Cross's pattern of waiting for Sarah's shifts to end. Most importantly, Sarah began reaching out to the other women who'd been victimized by Cross over the years. Dr. Lisa Chen in Oregon, Nurse Amanda Foster in Chicago, Dr. Sarah Kim in Seattle, women who'd been silenced and scattered, but who might be willing to stand together now that they weren't standing alone. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of Sarah's first phone call, Dr. Chen was booking a flight to provide testimony about her experiences with Cross. Nurse Foster was contacting her former colleagues at Chicago Memorial to gather evidence that had been buried. Dr. Kim was reaching out to other female medical professionals who'd encountered Cross over the years. What had started as one nurse's cry for help was evolving into a comprehensive exposure of predatory behavior that had been enabled by a medical establishment more concerned with protecting reputations than patients. By noon, the story had exploded across social media and local news outlets. The image of 87 motorcycles gathered to protect a single nurse had captured the public imagination, but the deeper story of systematic abuse and institutional failure was what drove the narrative forward. Riverside Medical Center, Dr. Cross's employer, found itself fielding calls from reporters, patients, and medical colleagues demanding answers about their employment policies and complaint procedures. The hospital's public relations department, caught completely off guard, issued a statement saying they were reviewing the situation and committed to maintaining a safe workplace for all employees. But the damage was already done. By afternoon, 3 more nurses from Riverside had come forward with complaints about Cross's behavior, complaints that had been previously dismissed or downplayed by hospital administration. A receptionist revealed that she'd been instructed to throw away flowers and gifts that Cross had sent to unwilling recipients, effectively making her complicit in his stalking behavior. The state medical board announced that they were opening an investigation into Cross's conduct, and the district attorney's office confirmed that they were reviewing the accumulated evidence for possible criminal charges. The very institutions that had protected Cross for years were now scrambling to distance themselves from him. Dr. Cross himself had become a prisoner in his own car. Every time he tried to leave the hospital parking lot, He found motorcycles following at a respectful but unmistakable distance. Not threatening, not harassing, just observing. The hunters had become the hunted, and the psychological pressure was unbearable. His attempts to maintain his normal routine were futile. When he tried to go to work at Riverside Medical, he found protesters gathered outside the hospital, many of them women who'd been inspired by Sarah's courage to speak out about their own experiences with workplace harassment. When he tried to go home, he discovered bikers stationed across the street from his condo, visible reminders that his behavior was no longer secret. The breaking point came when Cross tried to approach Sarah's apartment building that evening. He'd been driven by a combination of rage and desperation, convinced that if he could just talk to her privately, he could regain control of the situation. But as he turned onto Maple Street, he found Tank Rodriguez sitting on his motorcycle directly in front of the building, flanked by a dozen other riders. Tank didn't move to intercept Cross. He didn't make threats or gestures. He simply sat there, visible and unmovable, a living reminder that Sarah Martinez was no longer isolated and vulnerable. The message was clear. The old rules no longer applied. Cross sat in his car for nearly an hour, staring at the wall of leather and steel that protected Sarah's building. Finally, understanding that his reign of terror was over, he drove away. He would never return to Maple Street. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital, but this time she wasn't afraid. She was surrounded by friends and colleagues who'd gathered to celebrate the conclusion of the legal proceedings against Dr. Vincent Cross. The state medical board had revoked his license. Riverside Medical had terminated his employment, and he was facing criminal charges for stalking and harassment. More importantly, the case had sparked broader changes in how medical institutions handled complaints of predatory behavior. Mercy General had implemented new security protocols and staff protection policies. Riverside Medical had overhauled their complaint procedures and hired an independent ombudsman to investigate harassment claims. The State Medical Association had established a confidential reporting system for healthcare workers who experienced workplace abuse. Tank Rodriguez, his road rash healed, but his commitment unchanged, stood next to Sarah as she addressed the gathered crowd. The big biker had become an unlikely friend and mentor, checking on her weekly and introducing her to a community of people who understood the importance of standing up for others. 6 months ago, I thought I was alone, Sarah told the crowd. I thought that because someone had more education, more money, more connections than me, I had no choice but to accept abuse. I was wrong. I wasn't alone. I just hadn't met my family yet. She gestured toward the Iron Wolves and the other motorcycle clubs represented in the crowd. These people taught me that real strength isn't about intimidating others or using power to hurt people. Real strength is about protecting those who can't protect themselves, about standing up when others want to look away, about refusing to let evil flourish in silence. The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. The frightened, isolated woman who'd whispered for help had become an advocate for others, working with victim support groups and speaking at medical conferences about workplace harassment and institutional accountability. She'd found her voice, and she was using it to ensure that other women wouldn't have to suffer in silence. Tank watched her speak with obvious pride. The Iron Wolves had gained something too from this experience, a deeper understanding of their purpose and a recognition that their brotherhood extended beyond their club to include anyone who needed protection. They'd always known that strength should be used to defend the weak, but Sarah's case had shown them how powerful their collective voice could be when raised on behalf of justice. Dr. Cross, meanwhile, had disappeared from the city, his career destroyed and his reputation in ruins. The network of enabling that had protected him for years had crumbled under scrutiny, leaving him isolated and unemployable in his chosen profession. Justice hadn't required violence or vengeance. It had simply required light, transparency, and the courage of people willing to stand together against abuse. 1 year later, the Iron Wolves MC established the Sarah Martinez Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting healthcare workers who experienced workplace harassment and assault. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling services, and safe housing for victims who needed to escape dangerous situations. Sarah served on the foundation's board of directors alongside Tank, Hammer, and several other club members. The organization had helped dozens of people in its first year, proving that the brotherhood forged in that hospital parking lot had lasting power beyond any single case. The story of the 87 bikers who gathered to protect one nurse had become legendary in the motorcycle community, inspiring similar acts of protection and solidarity across the country. It reminded people that heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they wore leather and rode motorcycles, united by a code of honor that transcended social boundaries. For Sarah, the most important change wasn't external but internal. She'd rediscovered her strength, her voice, and her purpose. She continued working as a trauma nurse, but now she also served as an advocate for other healthcare workers, ensuring that what happened to her would be less likely to happen to others. The lesson of that night was simple but profound. No one has to face their demons alone. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen, to believe, and to stand up. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to whisper, "He's waiting outside for me," and trust that someone will answer, "Not anymore." He's not. In a world that often felt cold and indifferent, the Iron Wolves had proven that compassion and justice were still alive, riding the highways and back roads, ready to answer the call whenever someone needed protection. They were guardians in leather, angels on motorcycles, proof that the best of humanity often came from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that real strength comes from protecting others rather than exploiting them, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Help us spread stories of courage and compassion in a world that desperately needs both. And tell us in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Tank's place that night? Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is the courage to stand up when others want to look away. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.